good works that you let us do for you, Lord. We also pray for those who could not make it today because of illness, that you would comfort them and heal them. And we thank you for those who you can come and enjoy time together today, Lord. In Jesus' name. Amen. A couple quick announcements today. Unfortunately, if you don't know, Phil Inman passed this last week, and unfortunately Carrie can't be here because she has flu. So if you would have Carrie in your prayers, that would be great. Phil's service is going to be January 20th at 3 p.m. here at the church. So if you want to write that down, I know Diane, you're in contact with Carrie. So thank you for that announcement. So it's January 20th at 3 p.m. You can see in your bulletin that next Sunday we're going to have the Renovari wrap-up, and we'll be starting the week after that the new Tuesday study. It's on Tuesday, right? Yeah, Tuesday evenings. So that'd be great. Shout out to the deacons and elders. The new deacons and elders are going to be meeting at Caprock on your respective days, so make sure you look at that. But unless anybody has any other announcements, feel free to read both. Good. All right, Tanner, you want to put up the call to worship? All right. God is gone up with a shout, Jehovah with the sound of a trumpet.
Sing praises to God, sing praises. Sing praises unto our King, sing praises.
For God is the King of all the earth. Sing ye praises with understanding. Larry, thank you, sir.
I invite you to stand and worship together.
All creatures of our God and King, lift up your voice and with us sing. Oh, praise Him, hallelujah. Thou burning sun with golden beams, thou silver moon with softer gleams. Oh, praise Him. Oh, praise Him. Hallelujah. 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 Thou rushing wind that art so strong, ye clouds are sailing heaven along. Oh, praise Him. Hallelujah. Thou rising moon in praise rejoice. The ye lights of evening find their voice. Oh, praise Him. Oh, praise Him. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Let all things their Creator bless, and worship Him in humbleness. Oh, praise Him. Hallelujah. Praise, praise the Father, praise the Son, and praise the Spirit, three in one. Oh, everything that has breath, praise the Lord. Everything that has breath, praise the Lord. Praise you in the morning, praise you in the evening, praise you when I'm young and when I'm old. Praise you when I'm laughing, praise you when I'm grieving, praise you every season of the soul. If we could see how much you're worth, your power, your might, your endless love, then surely we would never cease to praise. Let everything that has breath, praise the Lord. Let everything that has breath, praise the Lord. Praise you in the heavens, joining with the angels, praising you forever and a day. Praise you on the earth now, joining with creation, calling all the nations to your praise. If they could see how much you're worth, your power, your might, your endless love, then surely they would never cease to praise. Let everything that has breath, praise the Lord. Let everything that has breath, praise the Lord.
Lord, we just want to hopefully live our lives of praise. And I know we take this time to mark the end of a year, this calendar that we've set up. And Lord, just pray that we can live our lives filled with praise this year. Let 2018 be a year of change and of praise and of hope. And we want to lift up everyone that's sick that can't be here, Lord. Let us just worship and keep them in mind, and let our love and your healing go out to them, Lord, we pray. When you walk into the room, everything changes. Darkness starts to tremble at the light that you bring. When you walk into the room, every heart starts burning, and nothing matters more than just to sit here at your feet and worship you. And we love you, and we'll never stop. We can't live without you, Jesus. We love you. We can't get enough. All this is for you, Jesus. When you walk into the room, sickness starts to vanish. Every hopeless situation ceases to exist. When you walk into the room, the dead begin to rise, 'cause there is resurrection life in all you do. And we love you.
and we'll never stop. We can't live without you, Jesus. We love you. We can't get enough. All this is for you, Jesus. And we love you, and we'll never stop. We can't live without you, Jesus. We love you. We can't get enough. All this is for you, Jesus. Jesus. Come and consume, God, all we are. We give you permission. Our hearts are yours. We want you. We want you. Come and consume, God, all we are. We give you permission. Our hearts are yours. We want you. We want you. And come and consume, God, all we are. We give you permission. Our hearts are yours. We want you. We want you. And come and consume, God, all we are. We give you permission. Our hearts are yours. We want you. We want you. And we love you. And we'll never stop. We can't live without you, Jesus. We love you. We can't get enough. All this is for you, Jesus. We love you, and we'll never stop. We can't live without you, Jesus. We love you. We can't get enough. All this is for you, Jesus. Jesus. When you walk into the room, everything changes. Darkness starts to tremble at the light that you breathe. Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you, Barry. Well, it was Brian's vacation last week, and unfortunately he has the flu. So Dave, would you please share with us the word today?
I will.
Thank you.
Are you
I don't want to put you on the spot or anything.
figure while I'm here, I might as well. Good morning, everyone. Actually, I heard that, so many people were sick. I'm just impressed that this many of us are here. This is like a big crowd for a sick church, Ellen sends her love. This is her week to work in the nursery at the church where we're going to now. We've been attending Living Waters in Medford. This was a church when we first moved up here, about 11 years ago. We attended that church for about 7 years and then got tired of driving from Rogue River to Medford all the time for church. And that's when we started, as you know, attending here for a few years. And now that we're back in Medford, we're back at Living Waters. A while ago, Brian and I met at Kaleidoscope Pizza in Medford. Great pizza. And we were just catching up with one another, talking about the coming year here at Hope, and we got to talking about teaching direction. You know, I asked him, Brian, what kind of preaching focus are you intending to have in 2018? Pastors love to talk about that. I moderate a Facebook group page of over 2,000 pastors, and you have to be a senior pastor to be in this group. And somebody, I think it was last week, said, "So what are you going to be teaching on this Sunday?" And oh my gosh, the things that pastors get excited about. Ask them what they're going to be preaching on in the coming year. They love it. They just go on and on and on. But when Brian and I were talking, he said that one of the things he wants to teach on in the coming weeks and months here is things dealing with the mission of the church. And so I said, well, then, if I'm going to come out and speak the last Sunday of 2017, I wanted to kind of lay some groundwork for that would then maybe hopefully make his job even easier. And of course, I always appreciate the freedom that Brian always gives me. I'll always say, well, is there anything I could preach on that would reinforce what you're trying to do at the church? And he always says the same thing. He goes, "No, I just trust your judgment." And I appreciate that. But if you have your Bibles, turn with me to James chapter 1. I'm going to kind of use these two verses to kind of as a springboard on some of the things I'm going to want to share with you this morning. James chapter 1, maybe many of you realize that James, the author of this book, was the brother of Jesus. Actually, the half-brother of Jesus. Same mother, different father. Jesus' father was God the Father, and this guy's father was Joseph. I've often tried to wonder, what was it like growing up with Jesus as your older brother? I mean, talk about trying to measure up. His room was always neat. He always got perfect grades in school. He never had to be reminded to put his, pick up his underwear and things like that. But really, it's kind of interesting to think about that, isn't it? What was it like? And did James know that his older brother was who he was? I don't think so. But at some point he did. We know that at some point that Jesus' brothers and sisters, because Jesus had brothers and sisters, at some point they caught on that there was something different about our older brother. And so we have James, the first chapter. I'm just going to read 2 verses from that book, and then we're going to launch. Look in verse 23. If anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of a person he was. The word mirror really only appears in the New Testament a few times. It's not something that there are a lot of verses about. I imagine the first time that a man saw his reflection was probably in a pool of water. Later then, and at the time that James wrote this book, the wealthy people could afford to have pieces of bronze polished so that you could have pretty much a reflection of yourself. But it still was not as good as what you and I are used to as far as mirrors. Glass mirrors were first produced during the 3rd century AD. I didn't know that. I thought they had not been produced until, I would guess, much later than that. But apparently in the 3rd century. And isn't it true? I don't know about you. Maybe it's just me. But I have like a love-hate relationship with mirrors. I mean, they're very, very handy, and you know, we all look at a mirror from time to time. And so they're very helpful, and at the same time they can be very discouraging. You know, you get up in the morning, or you, forgive me, you get out of the shower or something, and you catch yourself and you say, really? You know, is that really me? You know, when did that happen? You know, and things. And so, you know, I don't know what I think about mirrors, you know. They're helpful. But we all interact with mirrors and things. And many of you, I met a couple of you that I did not know, but most of you know that my job is I coach pastors, and I am also what they call a church consultant. And in doing that, one of the things that I do is I hold up a mirror, so to speak, to pastors and to his or her leadership so that they can see their reflection. And sometimes they like what they see, and sometimes they don't. But it's part of what I do. I hold up a mirror and say, this is what you look like. What do you think? You know. Let me share with you some stats. The fastest growing denomination in America is the Southern Baptist churches. They're the fastest growing. Non-denominational churches are the fastest growing group of churches in America. When Ellen and when I became a follower of Jesus, I immediately began to attend what was called a non-denominational church. And then when I went into the full-time ministry at 19, and then we went, Ellen and I, to plant some churches in Southern California. These were non-denominational churches. And way back then, it was kind of a novelty, you know, that you had a non-denominational church, because most of the churches were denominational churches. But today, we hear more and more about non-denominational churches. They are the fastest growing group of churches in America. Then there is a group of churches that are called mainline denominational churches. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before. But mainline denominational churches, of which Presbyterians are considered a part, mainline denominational churches have been in steady decline since the 1970s. And this is just, you know, this is information out there. That doesn't mean that every Presbyterian church, every Lutheran church, it does, you know, those are examples of mainline churches. Doesn't mean that they're all in decline, but generally speaking, mainline denominational churches, of which Presbyterians would be considered, have been in steady decline since the 70s. Now, let me share with you a little bit of my personal experience. I am currently working with about 60 pastors. That means, obviously, 60 churches that I talk to on the phone, either once a month or twice a month. This group of churches, this group of pastors, represent every denomination you could ever imagine. Female pastors, male pastors, conservative churches, liberal churches, Anglican priests. I've worked with Catholic priests. I worked for a while with a Catholic priest whose parish numbered 2,000 people. And I thought to myself, now what? You know, because I'm known as like the small church pastor guy, you know. And so there's this, you know, this priest that I worked with, but he wanted a coach in his life to help him work through some things. And so it was quite enjoyable. About 60 churches, every denomination. And most of the churches that I work with are under 100, talking about adults. Of that group that are under 100, almost all of, well, no, most of them, I would say, are around 50. And the majority of those churches that I work with every single month, they have either plateaued in their group or they are in decline. So to say that the majority of churches, especially of mainline denominational churches, to say that most of those churches have plateaued or are in decline is not an exaggeration. Many of these churches are aware and are concerned about their plateau or their decline. And this might surprise you to hear, but many of them are not aware that they are in decline, and they obviously then are not concerned. It reminds me of the patient whose doctor tells them that they are a high risk for cancer or for heart disease or a stroke, and they don't take it seriously until it's too late. There's a word for that in the realm of counseling. It's called denial. And there are many churches that are in denial about their situation. So when we're talking about churches, a church is either growing, or it has plateaued, or it is in decline. Now, the interesting thing is that just because a church has plateaued, by that I mean it has remained about the same size. In my field, we talk about churches that have plateaued. They have not experienced any numerical growth. They've kind of stayed at the same size for at least 3 years. Just because a church has plateaued does not necessarily mean that there is a problem. Sometimes there is. There often is a problem. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But sometimes churches, they really are reaching new people, but they're also losing people. Attrition. Every church has a degree of turnover in the course of the year. You might be tempted to look at maybe some of the more larger churches in Grants Pass, in Medford, and nearby. You drive by, you see a larger church. When you're part of a smaller church, you tend to think that every church looks huge in comparison to your church. You see a full parking lot, And the truth is, though, every single church has attrition. Every single church loses people. They move out of the area. They get mad at the pastor or something, so they go shopping for a new church. I mean, there's always going to be turnover. So not every church that has plateaued necessarily has a problem. But typically there is a problem that explains the plateau. But those churches that are experiencing a steady decline, and it might be very, very slow, but nevertheless it is a steady decline, they have a problem. And what I thought, and this is kind of a different kind of sermon this morning, I'm not really exegeting a passage of scripture, I'm just sharing with you some things that most churches never have anybody tell them. Most churches, they don't have a church consultant to share with them some of these things. I hope you find it interesting what I'm about to share with you. And I'll just give you a little heads up. At the end of my sermon, I'm going to give an opportunity for you to ask questions, because I think some of the things I'm about to reveal to you are going to make you curious, or I don't know what, angry, or I don't know what, But what I want to share with you, 11 years of working with churches, 11 years of working with smaller churches, 11 years of working with churches that have either plateaued or are in decline, I have discovered that churches like this, they have a lot of things in common. There are certain common denominators that I have found in all declining churches. And what I want to do this morning is I want to kind of hold this mirror up to you and let you decide if you see any of these reflected in your church. You might not, and that's fine. But at least I hope that you will find this interesting, okay? So, that's kind of like this message is, it's kind of like good news and bad news. That's what Brian said, what's the title of your sermon, And he always asks me this, and I always say, I don't know, I don't think, and then, but I got a hold of him early. I said, you're going to love this. I already have a title for my sermon, 3 weeks out. And so he liked this. And here are just a number of things that I found that all declining churches, and usually plateaued churches, have in common. And these aren't in any order of importance. They just, as I began to think of, what I do and what I've learned over the years, I wrote this list down. Number one, it is typical for churches that are in decline that they have a membership that is older, that is an older membership, 55 and older, and that age bracket is in the majority. So the majority of the members of the church are 55 and older. Another thing that I've noticed in working with churches that are in decline is that the movers and shakers in those churches, the leaders in those churches, typically are older people, 55 or plus, and the majority of the leaders in the church are in this age bracket. Another thing that I've discovered about churches that are in decline, things that they all seem to have in common, is that there seems to be what I call an inward focus to the neglect of an outward focus. By that I just mean that most of the focus is on what do we need to do to meet the needs of our existing members. This is an inward focus, what it's called, which is not entirely a bad thing. Because, a church that doesn't meet the needs of their members will probably not stay in business very long. But notice that I said to the neglect of an outward focus. And so I have found this in the church, that when I'm working with churches and I begin to speak with the pastor or the leadership of the church and try and get a feel for what the church does, what are the programs in the church, things like what do they talk about in their board meetings, etc. There tends to be this constant theme of, that this inward kind of focus thing. I find this in every church that is in decline or plateau. Here's another thing that I find. Churches like this, there is a resistance to the change necessary to reach and retain new people. Now, you talk to any church and you say, do you want to reach new people? Everybody says, yeah. You say, now you know that we might have to change. Everybody says, yeah. Until you want them to change something that's important to them. Then they say, no, whoa, take it easy here. It's like, everybody is open to change until they're not. And it doesn't take a lot to get church people to be resistant to change. One of the things I've found in working with churches is there is a resistance to change, because typically the change that some of these churches will need to embrace in order to turn things around and actually start reaching new people with the good news of Jesus, typically the change is significant. And they're not willing to do that. They're not willing to do that even if they know that unless something changes in a few years, we're going to die out. Just because too many of our members, they are at that age where they're just not going to keep on living. I've known churches, they know that making a decision not to change means that maybe in 5 to 10 years, they're going to have to close the doors of their church. Here is something else that I've noticed in churches that are in decline. That there is no concrete plan to reach and retain new people. And often, if there is a plan, and this sounds mean. I shared this with Ellen. She said, that sounds kind of mean. And usually, if she says that, she's usually right. Anyways, there is no concrete plan to reach and retain new people. And often, if there is a plan, that plan is naive and simplistic and out of touch with those they're trying to reach. Does that sound mean? No, because I was sitting there, I think it was yesterday morning or last night, and she goes, yikes, Maybe because I used the word naive, because naive just sounds like, there's no way to call somebody naive and it sound good, Their ideas to reach people are naive, simplistic, and out of touch with those they're trying to reach. By that I mean that most normal members of churches that have plateaued and are in decline, they have no idea really why their church is in decline. They think they know. And the opposite of that is true, that they also think they know what needs to happen to get their church to grow. But they don't. And part of my job is to help them see how, that I'm glad they have a plan, but their plan is simplistic. And they might say, well, our problem is that, we just don't have a very good children's ministry, so we just need to get a good children's ministry. As if you can pull that rabbit out of your hat. As if you can just say, oh, okay, poof, there's a good children's ministry. Sometimes they'll say, well, our pastor is not that good of a teacher or a preacher. I am not aware of any church that I've ever dealt with that is in decline, and in my professional opinion, the blame can be placed on the pastor. And it's just like never really, that's seldom is that the real issue. Preaching, we need to get better preaching, Well then, how do you account for the fact that we've got all these churches out there that have really good preaching, but they're still in decline? I had one church. I helped them realize, we got a problem. We're too inward focused. Yeah, Dave, help us get outward focused. And so I said, okay, one of the things I want you to do, get your leadership together, and I want you to brainstorm on things you could do to reach new people. And come up with a list, and then I want you to figure out what you think is the best thing on your list. And the next time I call you for a conference call, we'll talk about, the best thing you thought you came up with for reaching new people. And so, about a month came by, and I'm gearing up for my phone call at this church. I'm excited, they're just so into it, and I thought, man, this is going to be great. And now, once again, don't get mad at me if you really think this is a good idea. But the best idea they came up with was to have a bell choir. How many remember bell choirs? I mean, some churches had bell choirs, and it's not like put down a bell choirs, but it's something that was really a big deal in churches like 30 years ago. It wasn't unusual for churches to have bell choirs. Those of you that don't know what we're talking about, it's kind of exactly like what it sounds. You go out and you spend a lot of money on really expensive bells. And you, like, everybody's got one bell or two bells, and each bell is a note or something. It's a complicated thing to pull off unless you don't care if it's any good. But, and so everybody's doing this at certain times, and if it's done right, I mean, truly you're going, wow, that's a bunch of bells, and that's, but I had to say to them in this conference call, I said, please, I no offense intended, but do you really think that the average young family that has two kids, they're in their mid to late 30s, they're both holding down a job, they're busy, their kids are into sports, all this kind of thing, do you think that they're going to come to your church because they found out that you have a bell choir? And there was kind of like a long period of silence, and then, I heard a couple, because once again, I do everything over the phone. So if I have a conference call, I'm trying to listen for background noise, like doors closing, or, people walking out, or, something like that. And I heard a couple people snicker. But sure enough, the people who came up with the idea of a bell choir were older people who had nostalgic memories of being in a church with a bell choir. And they loved it. And see, that is an example of an idea, a plan to reach people that just doesn't fly today. Another problem with churches, if they do actually come up with a plan, and so you'll say to them something like, well, what do you think would be attractive to the average young family that doesn't go to church and two-income, busy people, Well, the longer you're in a church, the less you know those kind of people. You just don't know them. And so it's kind of like, you've got to hang out with the people that you think God has called you to reach if you're going to understand anything at all about what's of interest to them, you see. And so that's one of the reasons why churches that have plateaued or are in decline, if you're fortunate enough that this concerns them, if you're fortunate enough that then they try to develop a plan to reach and retain new people, this is one of the reasons why the ideas that they come up with are simplistic. We need to have better coffee. Well, that could be a problem. That really could. So I had one church say, I know, we're going to start a coffee shop in the church. I said, why would I go to your church and get bad coffee when I could go to, Starbucks, or I could go to Pete's, or I could buy this type of coffee? Plus, I bet your church doesn't have enough money to really pull off a good enough coffee bar that secular people are going to bother to come to. But it sounds good. Let's have a coffee bar. That's what attracts people. Let me move on my list. Some churches that have plateaued or are in decline, we're dealing with common denominators that I've found over the years. There is a mentality that reaching new people is the pastor's job. This is out there. It really is. I was talking to one pastor. I said, tell me, what are some of the things because he's saying, every pastor, they want to talk to me about how can I grow my church? Okay, this is another one of those things that for many pastors, they cannot shake that question out of their mind, which is not necessarily a really bad question, but it's not an easy question to answer. This guy wants to figure out how can I reach new people, and I said, well, tell me, what have you been doing so far to reach new people? And he said, well, really, the only thing that we've got going right now is the third Saturday of every month, we go knocking on doors to say hi to people in our neighborhood. I said, well, that's not a bad idea. It also is kind of old school, door-to-door visitation, knocking on doors. Some churches, it still works. But for the majority of people in our culture, they don't want a stranger coming up knocking on their door, But, it does work sometimes. He said, if third Saturday we go out and knock on doors, they go, okay, that's good. That's something. How many people in your church are involved in this with you? And there was a pause, and the guy said, well, Dave, really it's just my wife and I. And I said, okay, so really your church isn't doing door-to-door evangelism or knocking on doors. You and your wife are. I'm glad you and your wife are doing that. That's commendable, but you're telling me this is something your church is doing when really your church isn't doing it. It's not like you've got 15 people the third Saturday of every month that are going out and canvassing the neighborhood. But there is this reality, this mentality that it's the pastor's job to reach new people. This is something that I see regularly in churches that aren't growing or churches that have plateaued. A couple other things that I've seen in churches like this. Visitors to the church are rare, and they rarely come back. Baptisms and new members classes are rare. They hardly ever occur. I'll say that. When was the last time you baptized somebody? Oh, back in '87, or something, like that. When did you have a new members class or a confirmation class or something like? Oh, we haven't had anything like that for a number of years. Couple other things. In churches that are in decline, I see in many of them that time, money, and resources are allocated to those things that benefit the members of the church rather than those outside of the church. Now, once again, this is to be expected because you always have more members of your church than you do. Well, I guess that's not true. If you start thinking about people outside of your church, you're always going to have more of them than inside of the church. But in churches that are in decline, you see that all kinds of time, money, and energy is put into things that just benefit their current members. The next thing, and this is something that I'm not going to elaborate on much because I think maybe Brian will be doing that. The next thing is that in churches in steady decline or have been plateaued for a number of years, there is a limited understanding of the mission of the church. Where if you were to ask them, so what's the mission of the church? You'd get all kinds of different answers, if not just blank stares. What is the mission of the church? Most churches, they either have no idea what that is, or there is disagreement amongst the members about what the mission of the church should be. Now this is interesting. I've got just two more here. And then I'll give you the good news. Okay? Often in churches that are in decline or have been plateaued for a few years or longer, there are often one or two influential people in the church who are holding the church back and are resisting change. I find that all the time. Where the pastor will maybe say, well, I tried to implement change and it didn't fly. I tried to move the church to be more mission focused. It didn't work. And I'll say, well, it didn't work. He said, well, there are people that are resistant to it. Oh, really? Tell me about those people. And you might be surprised to find out how often it just narrows down to one or two people in the church. They might be in leadership. They might not be in leadership. But usually they've been in the church for a long time and they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of sway, and they, even though they might only number 1, 2, or 3 in, let's say, a church of 50, 60, or 100, you'd be surprised how one or two individuals can sabotage a church's attempts, a pastor's attempts to move that church to being more effective in reaching new people. This is something that I see time after time. And then finally, I guess my list could go on, but I only came up with this many. One of the final things on my list in churches that are in decline or have plateaued is that oftentimes the pastor is stuck in a maintenance mode. There can be a lot of explanations for this. By that I just mean the pastor's just trying to keep his head above water. The pastor's always putting fires out. There's always problems here, problems there, and really, they usually don't even notice that they're in a maintenance mode. They're just trying to keep the thing open, trying to, to pay the bills, trying to keep people happy, trying to figure out, all the things that pastors have to do that usually have very little to do with actually being a pastor. And they're in what we call a maintenance mode. Still with me? Okay? Now, that was kind of the bad news. Now here's the good news. Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Here's the good news. Is there any hope? Is there hope for churches that have been in decline or have plateaued? Is there hope for those churches to turn things around? Well, yes, there is. It is very, very hard. Okay? But it is possible. And just as I shared with you things I've seen in churches that are in decline, let me share with you quickly a few of the things that I see churches that have turned things around that they have in common, that they do. First of all, churches that turn things around, and by that we mean they become effective in reaching and retaining new people, not to the exclusion of their members. This is a fear that members of churches in decline have when talk of change occurs, when we start discussing how to reach new people, typically the old people, and I don't mean old in age. I mean the people that have been in the church for a while, they're worried now that their needs are not going to be met. It doesn't have to be either or. It should be both and. But there's this fear, okay? But churches, one of the things that churches who turn things around have in common is you will find that the church has experienced, the members of that church have experienced personal renewal in their own relationships with Jesus. Something happens either because of the pulpit ministry or because of small groups or I don't know what, but you find people begin to rekindle again their love for Jesus. And that love of Jesus, that dynamic relationship that we all should be experiencing with our God, affects us and makes us more open to change and gives us a greater heart for the lost. You see this in churches that turn things around. In churches that I've worked with that have successfully turned things around, you see that they achieve a unity surrounding the mission and the methods used to reach new people. Someone said the problem with most churches is not that, that they lack, vision, but that they have too many visions. There's too many people in the church that they think, no, the church, we should be doing this. No, we should be doing that. This is how we're going to reach people. No, this is how we're going to reach people. No, the mission of the church is this. No, the mission of the church is that. And churches that turn things around, there becomes a unity around what the mission of the church is and the methods that they're going to experiment with to reach new people. This is probably going to be one of the things that Brian's going to be speaking to you about in the weeks to come, the mission of the church. We need to get on the same page as to why do we exist as a church. A couple other things. Churches that effectively turn things around, and remember, I'm going to let you ask some questions in just a couple moments, okay? Churches that turn things around, somehow they embrace a willingness to change, and they know and understand that the change needed to reach and retain new people might be significant. And they get to this place where they say, okay, I know there's some things we need to change to be more effective in our mission. Let's talk about that. There's going to be no sacred cows. We're willing to look at everything in the church that might need to be adjusted. And the fear again is that you're talking about you're going to go in here and just blow up everything. It's rare that a church needs to blow up everything and start over from the ground up. Most churches, they just need to adjust. Some churches, they need to let some things die. They need to birth new things. But it's kind of like the difference between, building a house from the ground up and just doing a remodel project. It's the difference between doing a remodel project where you're taking out a wall and just, this room needs to be painted. The change sometimes is not that threatening, but sometimes it can be. Churches that effectively turn things around, you see they had a lot of patience because you won't turn a church around overnight. It takes time. It takes trial and error. Sometimes people, when a church is trying to change, they don't have patience with it, and they leave. And you have to be willing to say goodbye to some people who they can't hang in there for the change. And then other people, they think that, well, in 3 months, the church should then be packed with new people, and it's kind of like, that never happens, The only way that ever happens is if some church down the road blows up and all the members leave and come over here. And they go, oh, great. And I'm saying, that might not be as great as you think. Sure, you got warm bodies filling up the pews, but you're going to have a lot of problems when a church grows because of transfer membership. Let me let you in on a secret. Most churches in America and most of the large churches surrounding us have gotten that way because of transfer membership, not because they're reaching and retaining new people. It's because people at other churches get all upset about something and they go over to see the new church in town. That's kingdom shift. It's not kingdom growth, you see. It takes patience to develop a strategy for reaching new people. 2 final things, then we're done. not only patience, but churches that have successfully turned things around, they also embrace a continuous evaluation of how they're doing at reaching their goals. It's not unusual for a church to say, okay, we're going to do this. And so they start doing that. And then months go by and they're still doing that. And they never look at it and say, is that working well? Is it, a lot of the things that we have in our churches, they worked well at a certain time in the history of the church, and now they don't work as well anymore. But nobody knows because nobody takes the time to evaluate. I help churches evaluate what they are currently doing to determine, is what you're doing helping you achieve your vision or your mission or your goals? But it is fascinating to me how often churches, they never evaluate anything. Or they don't evaluate Sunday morning and the different components of Sunday morning and things. But churches that turn things around, they regularly evaluate. And the last thing on my list, and then we're done, I just have the word repeat. Because all those things that I said churches, the churches who turn things around do, it's like you don't just do them and then, I don't have to worry about that anymore. It's kind of these things have to be constantly hammered into us. We have to constantly be, trying to be renewed in our walk with Jesus. We have to be constantly reinforcing the mission and methods the church uses. We need to constantly revisit, are we open to change? What needs to be changed? What can be left alone? Patience and evaluating. It's just like you keep doing those things. Churches that successfully reach and retain new people, they just kind of keep doing those things over and over and over again so that they stay lean and mean, so to speak, so that they stay effective in what they're doing. So let me ask you this morning, were you able to recognize any of these factors here at Hope? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'm not here to judge anybody, I'm just here to hold up a mirror, see if you like what you see or not. If you like, fine, good. I want to pause for just a moment and give you an opportunity to ask me any questions about any of the things that I've shared. This is another thing where normal church people, they seldom are able to ask questions of a church consultant. And so I've dumped a bunch of stuff on you this morning. I realize that. I thank you that almost all of you were smiling at me. But I want to give you a chance to ask questions. Yes?
As you can see, we have no children here. We have very few. And I know we have tried a couple of different things, like after VBS, the VBS team sent we had 65 kids for VBS this year. We sent out a letter thanking them for their children and how we enjoyed having them, and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the letter, there was a picture of the VBS team, and we wished that they would come to the church. 0.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so we've tried several different things, and we're struggling. I mean, we'd love to have some youth in the church and have Sunday school every week, and have kids get up there and perform. Every once in a while, a song that they had learned in Sunday school or something.
Right.
How do we do it? Nothing seems to be working for us.
Yeah.
That's just one thing.
Reminds me of a stand-up routine by Steve Martin. He starts out, he says, I want to share with you how to become a millionaire. First, get $1 million. It's kind of, how do you have it start a children's ministry? Well, you get some kids. Oh, you're brilliant, and everything. That's really hard. So many churches do VBS. I'm telling you right now, most of the when I was pastoring, we did VBS. I really believe in VBS. Stop doing VBS. But when I talk to churches who have done VBS, I said, did it result in any of the parents whose children came to VBS coming to your church? Almost all the time they say no. And there's this mystique about VBS or similar programs that if we reach the kids, the parents will come. Sometimes this happens. Usually it doesn't. I still say reach the kids. And what we do see happen with VBS, you have kids coming from unchurched families, okay? What I have seen happen is then when that family all of a sudden faces crisis and they need God on their side or they need a minister, they will remember that church that their kids went to during the summer and they'll call it up. And then an opportunity for ministry to that family happens. But VBS seldom achieves a rush of adults coming. Sometimes the church has to develop a strategy of what will we do ongoing with the data that we received on these families. So everybody signs up, so you know their address and everything. And there's usually a one-time follow-up to that information. What can help is to have a broader, more multiple follow-up with those people. But when a church like ours, we still say ours, because we still think that, this is part of our family, we're doing pretty good. We do have something for kids. We really do. And that's the best that we can offer, and we got to be okay with that. A church, you work with what you have, not with what you don't have. And if you can only provide something simple and small for the kids that you have, then you try to do that as best you can until the time comes where a family does walk through the doors with 2 of their kids. Now, that family's probably going to say, why would I come here and you don't have anything for my kids when I can go to the big church down the road that has, oh my gosh, they got elephants and clowns and, they got all these great things, And what I used to tell people like that, because Ellen and I planted some churches, and so you have this period of time where you really can't offer people much of anything when you're a church plant, just the basics. I would say to those families, they say, what do you got for our kids? They say, nothing. I say, but I tell you what, I know you could go to another church and find something better for your kids. I know you can do that. But stay here and help me build something. And about half the people would catch that vision and say, okay. And half of them would go down to the church with, the elephants and the clowns and things. It's hard. There's no shortcuts. We do the best we can with what we have, waiting, and we build from there. Okay. Yeah.
People are so busy, especially people with children. They are ripping busy.
Yeah.
And then people who are single without children, they're busy trying to keep their head above the water. That's what I wish, and it doesn't seem like it would be necessarily inviting them. Sometimes they're working on Sunday, or they're just, their life is kind of in a turmoil, and those people, I wish we knew how to reach them. They're, maybe outside of the church, just do something, just to where we can.
And see, I like how you're thinking, because you're saying a problem we're up against, if we're talking about reaching new families, is that these families are really busy. And I'm saying, okay, I like that way of thinking. So then what can we do about that? That's what needs to be discussed. And we need to evaluate what could we offer that would be genuinely appealing and of interest to young families, let's say, that are already busy and stressed out. That's a hard egg to crack.
Some kind of help, some kind of something.
Could be. But you're thinking the right way. Okay. Yes?
Well, since I am a young single person who's very busy,
Yeah.
I feel like talking to others that a lot of times you want to feel like you're making a difference. And a lot of times church feels very selfish because you're going and you're sitting down for a couple hours out of your day and you're focusing a lot on the self, which is very important in that relationship. But I feel like a lot of people want to be able to feel like there's a mission, like you were saying, that change the world in a positive way.
Yeah.
As a young person, you want to feel like I go here because I'm helping make the world better.
Right. Did y'all hear this? Because like she should have been in the pulpit today. And I'm not kidding, because it's your generation. How old are you?
28 through.
Okay, it's your generation, a little bit younger, maybe 10 years older, that are particularly interested in what are we doing to have an impact in our world. She's exactly right. We have to start putting time, money, and resources into meaningful ways of touching people's lives. And when we do that, this generation says, oh, yeah, I'll do that. You know. But see, that is so helpful. But you know what? We don't have a lot of people in this church, in this age group, nor are we probably talking to them to say, well, what kind of church would you go to if you went to a church? You know. But when we tap into her brain and her values and older, it is very helpful. Thank you very much.
What can we do about demographics, though? Most of the young people that are graduating from high school, there's nothing for them here. They leave. We just don't have that many young people staying around.
And that is true. She said, what do we do about demographics? If we live in an area that maybe the population is in decline, the population is aging, where younger families are moving for jobs or affordable housing or whatever, they're moving into other areas, that's a legitimate problem that can't be ignored. Sometimes a church finds themselves in a geographical area where they probably will not grow. And so then we have to try to then, you know, it doesn't mean we give up, but it just means we're realistic. We offer what we can. We try to have as good a thing happening here as we possibly can. But in every community, there are still unchurched families and younger people, even though, and you're exactly right, many people move out of that area. Again.
One thing I know another deacon and I have discussed that we were going to bring up at a retreat was some more community outreach. And we were thinking stuff with like an Easter egg hunt, you know, for the children. We could do it in our backyard. You know, do hot dogs or something. Some things for our community around us to see that we're doing some community things. And right now, we're very involved with tailgate ministry, which is working with the homeless and the working poor. And so we're as involved as we can right now because we don't have very many participants from the church helping.
Right.
You know, just more community outreach things, things for the kids. One of our ideas was like a craft day, you know, on a Saturday for the community kids, have the parents come in and, you know, have little tables set up for bake and take type of stuff to get some interest.
Those are great ideas. Here's the trick in things like that. Like, I like it when a church starts saying, what can we do to, you know, do things in our community? Well, okay, that's the right way of thinking. That's a good way to start. The way that pays off is it pays off over time, and it pays off because of consistency. In other words, if you have, you know, one of the problems with VBS is typically it only happens one time out of the year, and then the church does nothing else, you know. But if you regularly do something in your community to reach out to people, whether it be, you know, bag lunches to homeless people or, you know, whatever it might be, you have to do that consistently all the time, because the more you do it, eventually you become that church that does that food giveaway thing. What is that? Who you remember that church that hands out bags of food, or is you know? And then you see, that's the thing with the special events. You only become that church by doing it, by discovering just a few things that you can really pull off. Don't think of 6 things you can't pull off. Maybe you can only pull off a couple things, Make sure that they're very meaningful, and make sure that you're doing them consistently. Eventually, you will become that church. Once you become that church, you're going to slowly start seeing some people respond. A couple more questions.
It's not really a question. Well, it's a question to you at the end. I mean, well, okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Brian is an incredible teacher of the Word. He's incredible, and he's so encouraging and inspiring. And he has these, renovare and abide, and all and it is so great for us because we grow in our relationship with the Lord. It's really, really good. I always worry that Brian's going to get discouraged because it doesn't seem like our church grows very well. It doesn't seem to, he's going to have Bible study on Tuesday night, or I think it's Tuesday night, it might be Thursday. Is it Tuesday night? And that's really good because we can invite people, that wouldn't come on Sunday. But you tell me, what should we do? What do we do?
Well, first of all, let me talk to you about Brian. He is really an odd pastor. I mean that in the best possible way. I agree. You should be worried about him being discouraged. I've never seen the guy discouraged. And, I'm like that safe kind of person that if he was discouraged, he could tell me that. I meet with him, and he just loves you people. He loves this church. He loves this town. He loves and I don't think he's phony. I mean, like I said, if he, pastors complain to me all the time because I'm not their parishioners, I'm not their board members, I can't fire them, or anything like that. And Brian is a very positive person. So is his wife, Carrie. They're unusual, So praise God, that we have a pastor like Brian. And you're right, he's a real good teacher. I'm a preaching coach. So also part of what I do is I know, what a sermon should look like. This morning is not what a sermon should look like. But like he's a really good communicator. And he's inspiring and, all that stuff you would hope to have. Be praying for him. But I can't tell you what to do, but you can begin to pray about what we should do. You can form groups and begin to talk about what we should do. The deacons should be talking about what should we do. The elders should be talking about what could we do. Once everybody starts saying what could we do, you're going to come up with a few things that are pretty good. Anybody else?
Is there an element of, say, technology or social media that churches have used successfully to grow or market themselves or their pastor? So we have Brian, and we love him, we think he's awesome, we'd like to share him with more people. How do we get him in front of more people?
Yeah.
Yeah, how do we use technology? What about Facebook? Now we have Facebook Live where it's cheap, where you put, we're posting our sermons, online. What are you look like you're itching to say something. Tell me.
We're on Facebook Live right now.
We're on Facebook Live. Hi, world! Come to Hope Presbyterian. We'll love you.
Is it still a consistency thing? Sure.
Well, a lot of churches are getting into Facebook Live, and not a lot of people are watching that. It's not that it's not working for some churches. It is. The church where we attend, they have a very huge online presence, and it does get some people's attention. But once again, I mean, if you're talking about unchurched people that you want to reach them, they're not on Facebook watching your church service. They're not going to do that. Christians who can't go to church on Sunday, they might do that. Someone who's shopping for a church, they might do that. So I think it's good what we're doing, because we're trying to be contemporary, and this is a legitimate way of getting the news out. But we're not going to see a lot of people respond to that, but still keep doing it. Yes, ma'am.
So do we have to move away from a more liturgical, traditional, rhythmic church in order to grow?
Is that not working?
You have a little bit
But to be
over
honest,
the years.
are you saying that that is no longer effective?
No, I'm not going to go as far as to say that it's no longer effective, but I will say that that kind of approach, by liturgical, we typically mean that the normal person, when they think of liturgical, they think that there's a lot of ceremony, stand up, sit down, repeat after me, responsive readings, which I personally like. Singing of hymns rather than choruses. Well, we made that transition a while ago, thanks to Larry and things like that. I don't think that we have to think so much about changing those things. I don't think that that's going to make a big difference. I think what we have to ask ourselves in how we do Sunday morning, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does the average person who's not churched, who comes to our church, what do they think about how we do church? What seems strange or confusing to them? We may want to make adjustments to that or not. But there are some, kind of more formal churches. There's not a lot of them, but some of the more formal churches, you use liturgical. I would not call us liturgical in the strictest sense. There probably was a time when Hope was far more liturgical than we currently are. But see, that's a good question when we're talking about evaluating. When do we ever evaluate? What does the Sunday morning experience, how do unchurched people relate to the Sunday morning experience? Do they relate well to it? Does it seem foreign? It doesn't seem foreign to us because we're all church people, Everything's all familiar to us. But if we want to reach people that have no church background, there's going to be things about what we do that is confusing to them. Maybe we change those things, maybe not. At the very best, we need to explain those things to people. And so I think it's a good question. But Hope is trying to, from where I knew like 11 years ago when I came here for the first time, before we began to attend here, this church in how they did Sunday morning was considerably different than how they do Sunday morning today. And I see that as movement in the right direction. So. Anything else? Again.
So what kind of things are not working in today's society?
What kind of things are not working in today's society? You can't answer that question because because every region across the United States, every town, every people group is different. So to make a blanket statement, this is not working in America, you can't do that. Because as soon as you do that, you're going to be able to identify one church that's doing that thing and it's working. You see, so we have to. Typically, I said that non-denominational churches are the fastest growing segment of churches in the United States. Typically, non-denominational churches have a contemporary worship. Well, we're doing okay with that. But they are churches that are very in the community and thinking about this. They are filled with people that are inviting regularly their friends, relatives, neighbors, and coworkers. That phrase is important. Friends, relatives, neighbors, and coworkers. Because we tend to say to people, invite your friends to Christmas Sunday, And some of you might think, well, I have, and they didn't come, And the longer you're in a church, the more times maybe you've invited your friends, and all of a sudden you think, well, I don't know anybody that's not a church person. But when you start thinking about friends, relatives, neighbors, and coworkers, then you've broadened that all of us have friends, relatives, neighbors, and coworkers who, if we had something meaningful to invite them to, they might respond favorably to it.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment, and I think that if you want to bring people into the church, it is directly tied to what our church does outward during the week. So when we focus outward into our community during the week, it's going to bring the people in on Sunday. And you have to find where our heart lies and where the Lord leads us and do those programs or those ideas consistently.
I would say the big thing, the number one thing that this church has going for us is Brian. The number two thing that I think our church has going for us is we're a warm, loving group of people. We love each other. If someone has a need, man, Hope is on it, you know, and things. That is a big old strength that we have. We are a loving community. How can we utilize that to its fullest? Those are the type of questions that need to be asked. Final question, and then we'll let you out of here. We'll wrap things up with the rest of the service. Boy, thanks for your patience. You know. Yes, Deb.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing this to us. It was very needed, and we appreciate it.
Good. You're welcome.
We don't need
I would encourage you to encourage all of the people who were not able to be here this morning to listen to it. If they're not listening to it live right now, are we also audio recording it, or?
Yeah, it's recorded, and we can get together with deacons and elders and different groups and review it.
Yeah, yeah. Tell you know, because you know, a lot of people weren't here, and just encourage them. Hey, you know, you really need to listen to this sermon. You know, so. Father, I pray that you would take all this stuff that I threw upon my friends here this morning, use it to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
I'd like to invite you to join me in worship.
You are my supply, my breath of life. Still more awesome than I know. You are my reward, worth living for. Still more awesome than I know. And all of you is more than enough for all of me. For every thirst and every need, that you satisfy me with your love, and all I have in you is more than enough. You're my sacrifice of greatest price. Still more awesome than I know. You're my coming King. You are everything. Still more awesome than I know. And all of you is more than enough for all of me. For every thirst and every need, you satisfy me with your love, and all I have in you is more than enough. More than all I want, more than all I need. You are more than enough for me. More than all I know, more than all I can see. You are more than enough, and all of you is more than enough for all of me. For every thirst and
we love you, and we thank you so much for the blessings that you pour out on us, that we get to live in this awesome country where we can be here in church without fear. And we can have the blessings of jobs. And we just thank you that we get to share a portion of what you have given us back to you and to your church, Lord. And we just ask that you would bless it and help us to use it in a way that glorifies you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Come back there.
Thank you for today. I love the prayer of thanksgiving that Mark gave. We're such a blessed people. We're so fortunate. And we say thank you, Lord, for all that you've given us and all that you've given us in this church. Speak to us in the weeks and months to come, to the leadership and to all the rest of us. And we will try our best to be obedient to what you say. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks.